Hello, my name is Tadeusz Żuchowski. I give introductory remarks to this section. The title of this section indicates just a moment. The title indicates unambiguously the connection between a monument and remembrance. This connection isn't only a generalizing statement, but it is the essence of the monument as such. The call for papers concerning this section underlines strongly that the word monument is etymologically derived in European languages from words related closely to memory. The term monument, from Latin monumentum, means nothing less than potency, the power of remembering and warning the place where it is remembered. Word monumentum, variously modified, is present in most European languages, although it has often its more or less adequate native synonyms. Art and architecture thesaurus online, created for years by Getty Center, was conceived as the contemporary lingua franca of art history. According to it, monuments are, quote, structures of importance or historical interest, typically erected in memory of the dead or of an important event, end quote. What is important behind this definition? It follows that the memory of the person or events is crucial for the monument, and that they must fulfill the criterion of importance or criterion of historical interest as well. The Getty definition amplifying in a structure called a monument is a connection between an event or a person embedded in a certain past and today. Furthermore, an important condition for becoming a monument, it is being in public space, and this was and is not fixed over time, just as social divisions have changed. The concept of public space has evolved too. Nowadays, the public space has gone beyond the Euclidean Cartesian three-dimension, and it can be defined by digital sequences. So, by specifying the framework condition for the functioning of monument, we come to the absolutely basic, the structure in public space. What has been said about space and structure has a formatic secondary denotation. First of all, the monument does not exist without a remembrance message. In other words, if there is nothing to remember, there is no monument. To emphasize the uniqueness of this structure, monuments commemorating events are called memorials, especially when they are about tragic events or related to the heroic feats. The monument is therefore a testimony of a particular interest of the past, regardless whether it is an interest in a person or in a broadly understood event. The monument is nothing but the specific rhetorically constructed synecdoche of the past. No wonder that the interest in monumental issue is closely related to the interest in memory in general. Particularly intensive in this regard are in the last years. For the purpose of this consideration, the relationship between the past and the memory about it is important due to the fact that the public is recipient of the monument. It is not about individual memory, but above all about creating a specific narration for collective memory. No wonder that the special role in the discourse about monument acquires idea arising from the Halbwachs theory. If collective memory is understood as a special narration unified from collection of remembrances created by the community, then on the one hand is the important problem of this community, i.e. the creators of collective memory, and on the other hand, the way of building such narration. Before the monument becomes a monument, someone chooses specific person, people, events to commemorate. And the effect of this choice is to be a key component of memory. Memory, especially memory of the past, is a convenient, tempting subject of mythocreative action, i.e. mythologization. Mythologization, however, is a rhetorical, non-cognitive process whose purpose is, in this case, to convince the recipient to a specific version of narration. But this is usually done through distortion, because what made the monument become a monument, whether in visual or in text form, is still being reworked and changed. Monuments from the assumption are thought to be places of common memory, but in reality, they rarely arise as a result of common reconciliation. Here, we come to a significant ascertainment: the collective memory growing out of the natural personal knowledge of the past, which is collection of individual memory, is not useful in the process of mythologization, because it is naturally variable and uncontrollable. Usually, it's about creating a dominant narration about the past using events and facts. Such narration is subordinated to a specific ideological goal. The collective memory is not a holistic total structure. Beyond it exists a collective non-memory, an antonym of memory. So is the fascinating question whether we can talk about collective oblivion. For these considerations, it is important first of all to clarify whether the psychiatric categories of repression are applicable to the study of collective oblivion. I mean such categories like cover memory and especially various false illusions of memory. One of them is the paramnesia, the most important of all. In psychiatry, this term describes the mechanism by which an individual accepts specific events, so it is about how they are preserved in active memory or how they are erased from it as a result of moving into the sphere of forgetting. The collective paramnesias are nothing but agreed version of the past. The main task of this version is repression from the memory of real remembrances, real, that is, formed in a natural process. It is evident that sometimes the process of repression, due to the layering of subsequent versions, subsequent paramnesia represses the previous one, what leads to total confusion. The above consideration remain in the close connection not only with defining the essence of the monument. Without them, it is impossible to define what is the antonym of memory. And again, without stating this, the consideration about the counter-monument become unfounded. And yet the concept of the counter-monument becomes more and more trendy. Taking into account the above-mentioned close relationship between the monument and the memory, it should be stated that the use of the term would be justified in relation to the structure evocating anti-memory. But if memory has its antonym, it is oblivion, why don't call these anti-structures as oblivments, in contrary to monuments, instead counter-monuments? Taking literally the term of anti-monument, it will be a structure sucking the memory like a black hole of energy. The structure called by the artist as counter-monuments, in fact, are monuments in which the traditionally understood materiality of the object is suspended. If they do not evoke memory, they are not monuments. But if they are not a black hole of memory, they cannot be called anti-monuments. Let's agree on that the monument is intensified through the use of durable materials such as stone or metal. Thus, the conveyed message, I forgot this picture. Thus, the convey this message about the event or the person gets intensely received and experienced. Such monument is like a nail which fixes a memory in certain place. A monument is important for a historian of art if he can examine its visuality. For study on visual structures, our discipline has developed a range of research tools and interpretation systems. The tension between the declaration and the effect, intentional and unintentional associations, are particularly important. The memory manifests and reveals through the monument, often in its unintentional intensity. The monuments which we'll present in this section were created in a specific context in a space which defines not only it, but the monument also supplements the space. As a result, the space changes with the monument history. Even when the monument is removed from space, it will be placed where the monument stood. There will be a place after the nail, sometimes invisible, but it is felt in the basis as a healed wound. The history of the country is recorded in the monuments. One could get the impressions that the past is perceived by wars, tragic and traumatic experience. A special role is played by monuments of famous people, monuments evoking pride or events, as well monuments expressing gratitude. Because history is living, changing, and not constant, it is being rewritten. So monuments that express narratives become sometimes unnecessary, unwanted. The phenomenon of rejection is noticeable in countries where the community has less to say about the monuments than the institution of power. There, the monuments that are not accepted by the policy are threatened. But in the moments of its infirmity, the monuments that represented it are removed and demolished. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to session D, whose subject is, as we know already, image, history. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Monuments as a remembrance image. My name is Jagoda Hernik Spalińska. I'm a theatrologist from the Institute of Art of Polish Academy of Sciences, and I'm really honored to be part of this great event. So the plan is that we will have 4 talks, followed by a commentary by Professor Żuchowski. And please take a look at the paper which was distributed, I think. This is written presentation by Mrs. Melzacka. And as I understand, Professor Żuchowski will refer to this paper as well in his comments. So. Are you there already? Okay. So after commentary, we will have the open discussion. And now we will start with our first speaker, Mrs. Burcin Cakir from Turkey. Mrs. Cakir is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Glasgow Caledonian University. She studied English and political science at Bilkent University and completed her MA in European political history at the History Department of the same institution. She received her PhD in history at Istanbul University, and her dissertation was a transnational study on gendered nationalism, the discourse on modern women as citizens on the Ottoman Empire, Turkey and Britain, 1860-1930. Dr. Cakir research interests cover war, gender memory, religion, and nationalism, with a recent focus on aspects of First World War in the Middle East. Maybe I will add that Mrs. Cakir has received research grants from Trinity College Dublin, and the Georg Eckert Institute in Germany. And the title of the presentation is Diplomacy and Death, Construction of Gallipoli War Memorials and State Agency. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great honor to be here today. Beata, you have great organizational skills. Can you hear me? No? Okay. I said it's a great honor to be here, so I feel very happy to be with you today. So my presentation is basically, will take you to somewhere else, geographically and periodically different than we have covered so far. Diplomacy and Death, the construction of Gallipoli War Memorials and State Agency. I am a First World War historian, so I should say that my paper is based on the very well-known arguments of prominent First World War historians such as J. Winter, John Horn, and of course Paul Fussell. And this is a project that I have been working on for the last 2-3 years, and it has finished. I have submitted my manuscript to the publisher, and now I move to another topic, which is the visual religious propaganda of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. So this was a project that I worked very hard on it for a couple of years, and it was the centenary of the First World War, so it was very timely indeed. Scholars have increasingly focused their attention on the present movement to remember and commemorate the men who died in the First World War. Recent research focuses on the various phases of the war memorial movement. Undoubtedly, politics is one of the main manipulators of this operation. It manipulates memory of the event and its commemoration to redefine, to use, and to control the past and thus the future. The state controls public spaces critical to the reproduction of a memory. The overall objective of my paper is to display how memories of war are constructed and reconstructed through building of memorials in Gallipoli and the manipulation of public memories of this event to serve state-to-state reconciliations and political and economic interest. The landscape of Gallipoli is never naive, never innocent, as Burcin argued. As in the case of Gallipoli, the exceptional ability of the peninsula to support a multitude of official narratives and collective memories appears to stem from the fact that it contains memorials and cemeteries for soldiers of numerous national origins. The battles of the Gallipoli Peninsula were witnessed terrible loss of life. The battle lasted over 259 days and consumed over 500,000 casualties. The thousands of young men killed in the narrow trenches of a vast train had a lasting impact on transnationalism of its collective memory. Even the battles were raging on, the battlefield cemeteries and small memorial began to be constructed in the peninsula. As Charles Bean, the Australian war correspondent to the peninsula, and he was an historian as well, wrote, "The day is far off, but it will come when splendid mausoleum will be raised over these heroic dead, and one foresees the time when steamers will bear upon the Aegean pilgrims, come to honor the resting places of friends and kindred, and to move over the charred battlefields of Turkey." After the evacuation in December 1915, the bodies remained unburied with their bleached bones lying in the sun until the return of the British 4 years later. The Imperial War Graves Commission turned disorganized cemeteries of Gallipoli into beautiful repositories ordered white stone. According to the Treaty of Lausanne, the land of the cemeteries were given to the control of the Allies. However, after the success of national struggle in Turkey, the issue flamed in Lausanne Peace Conference. With the Treaty of Lausanne, the land of the Allied cemeteries were granted to Imperial War Graves Commission. The physical characteristics of the cemeteries and memorials, just like the political and social narrative of Gallipoli and the commemoration and memory born out of it, has been under constant change since 1920s. Decorating the peninsula by memorials initiated the first diplomatic relations between former enemies. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne is often assumed to be the first evidence of normalization of relations between former enemies. No doubt that Atatürk wished to establish cordial relations with the British and the French. After years of warfare, Turkey needed time to recover. Lausanne could provide at that time. To a significant extent, the Treaty of Lausanne gave the new state, Turkey, some breathing space and time to deal with the internal matters. Treaty of Lausanne also allowed allies, particularly the British, to turn its attention to the commemoration of those lost in Gallipoli. Sir John Burnet, a Scotsman, were selected as the main architect for the Imperial War Graves Commission and visited Gallipoli in 1919. After vigorous efforts to survey the area, 31 cemeteries were found containing 1,900,000 graves in all, only 6,000 of which could be identified. Those missing at the battle remained around 2,700,000 and will be remembered on 6 separate memorials built throughout the 1920s. As the main British memorial dedicated to Gallipoli, the Memorial of Cape Helles on the tip of the peninsula also commemorates Australian soldiers who went missing at Helles, as well as British and the Indian soldiers whose graves were never found. Situated on the highest point of the cape and at the center of the memorial looks out to the Asian side of the Dardanelles. Burnet specifically designed the Cape Helles monument so that it would be visible to ships passing through the straits. The number of delegations visiting Turkey for commemorations was continuously increasing by the end of 1920s. The Australian Prime Minister visited Gallipoli in 1925, and the Prince of Wales, who later became the British monarch, Edward XVIII, visited Gallipoli in 1927. In 1926, a British delegation of veterans and family members made pilgrimage to Gallipoli and Salonika. The organizers were the St. Barnabas Church, and despite receiving official commission from Ankara to land at Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay, the landing was denied, which led to very serious testimonies, published in which there were no kind words spoken about the Turkish government or on the bravery of Ottoman soldiers during the 1915 campaign. This event, in a way, taught a lesson to Turkish authorities that they had to comply with the future requests made by the Anzacs and the British and the government agencies to allow visits to the peninsula. For the Ottoman-Turkish side of the story, the immediate aftermath of the Gallipoli, there were only 4 very, very modest monuments built to remember the fallen. This is understandable, considering that the army was continuously at war. Turkey was at war for around 14 years, starting from the Balkan Wars to the end of the Independence War. Throughout 1920s, there was an influx of state building in Turkey. However, these mainly focused on the building of Atatürk cult, as Mustafa Kemal Atatürk being the founder of the Turkish Republic. The agenda of the newly established republic during 1920s was found in creating a nationalist character, securing the borders, consolidating the power, formulating a national identity, and establishing a definitive rupture from the Ottoman past, and Gallipoli, in that case, was not at the top of the list. It was in 1924 that some of the MPs, Turkish MPs, brought the issue of constructing a Gallipoli monument to debate. But this request, was asserted that the friends of Gallipoli shivered and cried at the magnificence of the monuments of the Allies and reminded everyone that thousands of Turkish heroes were buried there, asking that memorial construction issues to be put into the agenda of the Turkish Republic. Yet these requests, these demands were disregarded on the pretext of economic difficulties. In 1926, for example, if I give you an example, British ambassador to Turkey, British ambassador to Ankara, Pemberton, notes that Turkish soldiers held a modest ceremony to commemorate their dead. He writes that the first official Turkish commemoration of Gallipoli held were of a military nature mostly. In his diaries and in his letters, he mentions that the Turks were not demonstrative, and nothing could be more modest. The Turks raised no other memorial to their dead. Here, there are to be found Turkish cemeteries, but they are not marked or intended to be remembered. Doublets of some of our enemies have found a resting place in the Christian burial grounds. So he was in a way criticizing the Turkish government for letting those martyrs laying in a Christian burial grounds. The commemorations and monument building themselves came to be elaborate, and the first signals of this change seem to be given in 1931. In 1931, we know that Internal Minister of Turkey, Surikova, was present at the ceremonial commemorations. That same year, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk wrote an article for the Daily Mail, the title of which was "Remembered by Allies and Former Foes." So what was changing starting from 1930s onwards for Turkey? There are a couple of explanations to that. First reason can be considered as the British and Anzac grievances. Atatürk read about the concern for the Gallipoli graves in several foreign newspapers. He was already aware of the concerns of the parents who had lost their sons at Gallipoli and their demands, along with the fact that the pilgrimage to the site will be continuous and increase in numbers in the coming years. And he definitely saw it as a way of establishing new alliances. We also know that there was an obvious emergence of a more self-confident Turkish state, especially in terms of foreign relations in 1930s. The newly established Turkish Republic was consolidated in 1933, and the reforms for modernization had been completed. In 1930s were a time when Turkey tried to position itself clearly with the Western alliance system and through foreign diplomatic channels. Turkey was openly in search of an alliance to accommodate itself on the eve of the Second World War. For the newly founded Turkish Republic, it was a daunting task to replace the image of the Ottoman, which was still prevailed in the international political idea. And looking at the international landscape, the beginning of 1930s was a time when Treaty of Versailles started to collapse and dictatorships were on the rise. Atatürk was also regarded as a dictator by some circles, and he wanted to change his image. And the foreign interest in Gallipoli could be turned into an opportunity to improve the young republic's image abroad. In terms of international dynamics, we know that Mussolini explained his desire to extend Italy's territorial boundaries, and Turkey's concern for security stemming from the militarized status of the Straits seemed to have played a key role in changing the attitude towards Gallipoli. As revisionism in political arena gained momentum, the ruling elite in Ankara began to consider these times suitable for a change in the Straits regime. In the League of Nations Council in April 1933, the Turkish foreign minister brought the issue of revision of the Straits. As the goals of this effort to remilitarize the Straits, the demand of Turkey to remilitarize the Straits had only one goal: providing security for Turkey and for its allies in quotation. And notwithstanding initiatives at international level, the Turkish government began to take some violent and radical steps to improve the security of situation in and around the Straits area. For example, in June 1934, 1,500 Jews living in Gallipoli were shocked as their residents began to loot their shops and houses. As a result of these events that would be remembered as the Thrace pogroms, some Jews fled to Istanbul and some fled to Palestine. Atatürk was at the time visiting Gallipoli with the Iranian Shah during these events. All in all, British assessments concluded that the remilitarization of both the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus were favorable to the political climate. No need to mention the group of British visiting Gallipoli in 1934 on the famous Duchess of Richmond, or details of the King Edward visits in 1936 as a sign of peacemaking and state-to-state reconciliation with long-term impacts on the British-Turkish alliance. King Edward's yacht, Nahlin, reached Gallipoli, and Edward visited the graves of the British and the Empire soldiers and the Mehmetçik monument out of respect. In June 1936, the Montreux Convention was signed. Most significantly, the Turkish government gained the right to remilitarize the Straits. And for the first time in over a decade, Turkish soldiers marched onto the Gallipoli Peninsula, and they have realized that the peninsula is now filled with foreign and Christian symbols. As the Second World War loomed over Europe, the threats from the Italians and the Soviet Union concurrently increased, and the Turkish government blocked access roads, remilitarized the Dardanelles, and rearmed their forts on the peninsula. Even the Imperial War Graves Commission was restricted to particular areas and forced to work under the control of the Turkish military. The way that the 1934 commemorations were organized seems to highlight the changing official perspective. First and foremost, the victory of Gallipoli for the Turkish authorities was elevated to the status of a national holiday, national day, and the date was included in the national calendar. As we know, Atatürk died in 1938, and for the entire duration of the Second World War, Turkey managed to maintain neutrality of the Turkish state by stalling its entrance into the war until February 1945, when victory of the Allies was ensured. In 1944, the Turkish government set plans in motion to build a major memorial on the peninsula. During the 1950s, Turkish government also made tourism a part of state policy to improve Turkey's image abroad. Gallipoli provided a bridge between Asia and the European, and between Asia and Europe, and between East and West, and already filled with the symbols of the foreign nations, Western countries, and an established site of pilgrimage was an ideal step to initiate tourism plans. For example, in 1952, the two sides, Allied and the Turkish side, came together for a mutual purpose for the first time in 1952, as I said. The construction of a large Turkish memorial soon became a top priority. The funds for the project were so low that the Turkish government called to raise funds for the memorial construction. It is very interesting that British Legion in Turkey donated Turkish lira for the construction of a Turkish memorial. And Turkish newspaper Milliyet also started a national fundraising campaign for the memorial construction. In 1960, the Matriz Memorial was finally finished and opened to the public. So it took almost over 15 years to construct this memorial due to the lack of funds. Moreover, the new Turkish government actually made visitations easier by lifting the military restrictions on mobility in 1962. When we come to 1970s, new memorials commemorating the Turkish deceased were built alongside several British and Anzac memorials. In 1973, the Turkish government established the Gallipoli Peninsula Historical Park. The park was designated a National Heritage Site and was added to the United Nations list of national parks and protected areas. 5 monoliths were completed and opened to the public between 1981 and 1984, particularly focusing on the heroism of the Turkish troops and especially the heroism of Atatürk, as some who are familiar with the Turkish history will remember. It's the time of the coup d'etats back in Turkey, so the heroism, the cult of the Atatürk has to be re-established again because the army was in control of the Turkish internal and external politics. In 1985, the Turkish government invited several Australian and New Zealand veterans and delegates to Gallipoli for the 70th anniversary celebration of the campaign. That same year, the Turkish government opened several museums and information centers at the peninsula. At the 75th anniversary commemorations in 1990, official delegations from Australia, New Zealand, Britain and France were joined by approximately 1,200,000 pilgrims. And this was an astonishing number, and it also gained a lot of news coverage in the foreign media. And that year, in 1922, we saw a proliferation of memorials and statues glorifying the Turkish role in the Gallipoli campaign, because there were many foreign people coming to Turkey, so it needs to be underlined that Turkish presence was the dominant one. A statue of the famous Colonel Seyit, as you see on the PowerPoint, the man once depicted on the Turkish stamp carrying the 600-pound shell, was built. Another statue entitled to Respect to the Turkish Soldier was constructed as well in the same year. Mehmetçik is a common generic name given to the Muslim Ottoman soldier at the war, as some of you may be already familiar with it. Foreign and domestic attendance at Gallipoli Anzac Day celebrations actually rose every year from 1995 to 2000. For example, the 85th anniversary of the Gallipoli campaign in 2000 was a record year for the peninsula. Spectators at the ceremonies estimated over 1,500,000 visitors. By the summer of 2007, it appeared that Turkish tourists overwhelmingly began to outnumber their foreign counterparts on every day except Anzac Day. In recent years, visiting Gallipoli and the War Memorial and the monuments associated with it is almost seen as a rite passage for the citizens of Turkey. While, for example, while the tours of the Gallipoli are not mandatory activities in which all schools must participate, the sheer number of school children visit from the four corners of the country. For example, if I give you a number, there were around 100,000 students that are brought to the site on a bus tour each year. The Matrice Memorial has become a rather popular symbol in the nationalist circle, as always. It is utilized in photos and commercials as a representation of the Turkish values and morals, and the sacrifices made to get to this point in the present eyes of the young people. I have a very long conclusion, but to cut it short, I will not go into the details of the theories, but rather cut it short with simple sentences. The state constructs itself by opening up new spaces, closing others, inscribing them with marks and symbols of state power, and organizing urban space in accordance with official national ideology. And war memorials are the collective symbols of this official national ideology. While the monuments and the commemoration ceremonies provide for a public means of mourning, they are also political acts, and they cannot be neutral. They cannot be naive. In addition, not only the monuments and the memorials inspire memory, but they influence the way memories are recalled or recounted. The monument created a basis, a common experience that will be similar to all visitors of the site. By attaching personal experience to the monuments, they are in fact legitimized. The state policies are in fact legitimized. They act as a site of commemorative interaction, where individuals must come to terms with their relationship to the collectivity and to their state. And there's also another interaction. The state comes to terms with another state through memorial diplomacy. My inclination is that this type of a study would also provide an interesting view of how narratives of Gallipoli have been utilized at different points of history for different purposes, mainly for economic purposes. If I give you a couple of examples from the recent rhetoric on Gallipoli, of course, there are countless of myths on Gallipoli, especially from the British and the Anzac, British, Turkish, and the Anzac side. For example, for the 75th anniversary, Americans were invited to the ceremonies, although they haven't been participating at all at Gallipoli. And of course, Indians, Gurkhas, and Arabs were forgotten. They weren't invited. For example, another example, in 2003, Australians were denied entry since some Australian cities recognized the Armenian genocide that year. Up to early 2000s, commemorations were mainly militaristic in nature, and this is changing in Turkey right now. Another clear example of this is the constant memorial erection by the Turkish government to beat the Allied presence in the peninsula. Current government initiated a plan which is called the Long Development Plan in 2001, and promoting Gallipoli for tourism revenues and marketing Gallipoli for the party ideology is taken into government agenda. From the government perspective, there is an obvious intention to teach the younger generations about the Ottoman Empire and its Islamic foundation. For example, the centenary commemorations started with a prayer for the first time. And for the centenary commemorations, Turkish government sent letters, invitation letters to hundreds of governments, hundreds of states, and decided to celebrate it on the 24th of April instead of 25th of April. And we know that 24th of April is the date for the Armenian genocide, while the real date for the Gallipoli commemorations is the 25th of April. So, as this memorialization, as this monument building will continue, I argue that Gallipoli will be both muse to a variety of narratives, memories, and myths. And my concern is political alignments change, enemies become friends, veterans fade away, new conflicts left many people dead, and perhaps at the end of the day, the only real comrades in arms are the dead who lie on the silent battlefields of Gallipoli. May rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cakir. And our next speaker is Olga Barbasiewicz, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Middle and Far East Studies at the Faculty of International and Political Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She holds a PhD and MA in political science, as well as an MA in Japanese studies. She held the JASO scholarship and studied international relations at Tsukuba University in Japan. In her current research, she focuses on memory politics and Japanese-Korean relations in regard to the alliance with the USA. Dr. Barbasiewicz was a visiting professor at Japanese, Hungarian, and German universities. And Mrs. Barbasiewicz will speak about hidden memory and memorials, remembering Korean victims in Hiroshima.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, to justify why I'm here, and I'm taking you just much further than it was done during the previous speech. I would like to tell you about my research. So I'm taking into consideration the comparative perspective of Polish-German and Japanese-Korean relations, since I treat these countries as those who experience the tragedy of war, but in contemporary world, they are staying in the international community as equal partners. So both cases, European and Asian, they represent different shapes, different reconciliation processes. So what is important here, and why did I choose Korea, is that Korea is, in my opinion, of course, very similar to Poland, the Polish case. So the remembrance of the war atrocities is vivid in both Poland and Korea. Like Polish people, they remember not only the Second World War, which was a very tragic part of our Polish history, but they also remember the time of losing our territory for 123 years. And the same case is with Korea, who suffered the annexation from the Japanese side from 1910 until the end of World War. And so we come to the end of the World War and to the A-bomb tragedy. So the title of my presentation is Hidden Memory and Memorials, Remembering Korean Victims in Hiroshima. So the place, which is, I suppose, for most of you, the place that is connected to Japanese memory, to Japanese-American relations. But we cannot forget that there were also other nations, and I will focus on the monuments and on the memory of the Korean victims. So just to give a brief introduction to my today's presentation, I would like to talk very briefly about the war memory in Japan. So when you talk about World War II, the most obvious thing for us when it comes to the Asia-Pacific theater is the A-bomb, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we can, as I told before, easily connect it to American-Japanese relations. So even if we are aware that Japan caused like serious problems, tragedy in the Asian continent, Japan is frequently justifying it while saying that they are the biggest victim because they are the only one country that suffered the atomic blast, the atomic attack. Therefore, in Japan, something called like higaisha ishiki, so the awareness of being a victim, is vivid. And this is what makes Japan forget, like Japanese society and politicians, forget about the things they caused in Asia and Pacific and just talk about World War II only through the aspect of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The special term I will use during my presentation is Hibakusha. Hibakusha are the people who suffered the who passed away during the atomic attack. So this word is broadly used in research conducted by different researchers, not only Japanologists or Japanese studies specialists, but it also went into the terminology of researching the policy and the history of Second World War in Asia Pacific. So I will just use it during my speech, so this hibakusha will be frequently told. So just a very brief introduction to the place I will be introducing today. So this is the Peace Memorial Park. It is in Hiroshima, and what I would like to emphasize is that Hiroshima, like among those two cities bombed by Americans, is the only one where this kind of memory is left. In Nagasaki, of course, there is a monument, but there isn't such a space that brings the whole history. Of course, only the history of 6 August back to our eyes, so back to our minds. So if we look, I will find this. Oh, it's here. So this pointer. So if we are tourists and we want to sightsee Hiroshima, we have to just leave the tram in Genbaku-domu. Genbaku-domu is the A-bomb, so we've got it here. So this was a commercial and trade center that survived the bomb attack, even if it was very close to the bombing hypocenter. So if we want to take nice pictures, maybe it seems funny now during this scientific conference, but we walk through the bridge and we take some pictures, and they come like this. It's very nice. So then we go to the Flame of Peace, we see the Pond of Peace, we see the Son of Tsetanov for the A-bomb victims. So the most important monument during all celebrations of the Hiroshima tragedy, and just we move to sightsee the museum. So it is called Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, just to see everything. So if we look through this path, we miss one important monument. It is called the Monument in Memory of the Korean Victims of the A-bomb. And today I will focus on this certain monument. Just so this brief guideline through the Hiroshima Park, I think it was very useful for you to understand why did I pick up this topic, the hidden memory and hidden memorials, though they are just involved inside the park. But it wasn't like this from the beginning. In 1999, this monument was moved here. Before, it was on the opposite side of the Honkawabashi Bridge. This was the place where the body of the Korean Prince EU, was found. It was very convenient for the municipal government and policymakers because they could just build the needed monument just outside the whole place of memory. And leave it here because, you know, Koreans, your prince was found here. So to commemorate Koreans, we will use this specific place. What I would also like to add is that all these monuments and memorials that were just briefly introduced through this map and pictures, they are frequently used as a political tool in both like regional, national, and international policy. So what for? First of all, to promote Japanese anti-nuclear attitude. And secondly, to create the picture of Japan as a country that suffered the war atrocities. So there is nothing about Japanese policy towards the Asian countries during World War II. And this is what we can call the oblivion. So Hiroshima Memorial Park's monument looks like this. And this is basically called, the full name is the Monument in Memory of Korean Victims of the Ape Bomb. But we can say that it also characterizes the Japanese politics of remembrance towards Korea. So to place Korea just besides the real policy and the real remembrance of World War II. If we still refer to, to the books that were written, to the research that were conducted in regards to Hiroshima, we can find like numerous research, numerous books, those for scientists as well for those who are just interested in this great tragedy. But rarely we may find the information about Koreans. And the number of Koreans that lost their lives was a great number. It was like 70,000 people who were injured or just passed away. And it is, of course, not confirmed. It's like from 50,000 till 70,000, because nobody knows how many of them were there because they just perished. So the world was informed about the Koreans' tragedy in Hiroshima 1 year ago, in 2016. And it was because of American President Barack Obama, who was the first sitting American president who visited Hiroshima Park and who paid tribute to those who passed away. The thing is that it wasn't planned for a long time. It was just a fast decision during the G7 meeting that was taking part in Japan last year. And all the politicians and President Obama, they went to Hiroshima to just pay the tribute, as I said. So when President Obama delivered his speech in Hiroshima, at the very beginning he told, "Why do we come to this place, to Hiroshima? We come to ponder a terrible force unleashed in a not-so-distant past. We come to mourn the dead, including over 100,000 Japanese men, women, and children, thousands of Koreans, a dozen Americans held prisoners." So the world understood that there weren't only Japanese there. There were also Koreans. If you look and try to analyze this statement, you can see that Obama put Koreans just in front of Americans. Of course, it is his politeness. But there is also the case in the US that there are states and electors who are from Korea, so who are half Koreans or who are just or whose roots are in Korea. For example, the San Francisco governor, he's from China, but he is very very strict on remembering Asians in the US and to disremembering, we can say, Japanese in the case of being the victims. So this is the moment. So 1 year ago, this was the moment when the world's eyes just looked at Hiroshima in different ways, in different way. Of course, Obama, maybe of course it's wrong word, but Obama didn't mention to do it by purpose, just to make the world audience shocked that he remembers that there was not only Japanese, but there were also Koreans. A very strong NGOs, non-governmental organization, is the Association of South Korean Atomic Bomb Survivors. And when they knew that Obama is planning to visit Japan for the G7 meeting, and when he mentioned that maybe he will just drop by to Japan, to Hiroshima, they started to send numerous letters saying, you have to come to our monument and to pay tribute, because these were Americans who killed like thousands of Koreans. Of course, he couldn't do this, but he could mention those names. The thing is that it wasn't like accepted by this organization. So they told that Obama didn't do what they wanted, because he didn't go to the Korean monument. I will call it, use this shortcut, Korean monument. He only went to this Setonov, because this is the place where all the flowers are presented and so on and so on. And he watched the A-dome from this perspective. He didn't come to this monument. Of course, we can understand why. It wasn't the purpose of Obama to praise like Koreans in this case. It was the meeting, he was there with Japanese Prime Minister, and it wouldn't be good for bilateral Japanese-American relations to do so. So he left it by. So in my paper that I provided for this presentation, I would like to just answer for 3 short questions, like what is the history of Koreans in Hiroshima, so why they were in Hiroshima during the day of the attack, and what is the role of the monument in memory of the Korean victims of the A-bomb in Hiroshima in preserving the memory of the August 1945 events, and what are the political implications of the Korean victims' remembrance and oblivion? So, as I mentioned in the introduction, and the comparative perspective of Polish-German and Korean-Japanese relations, Korea was occupied, was annexed by Japan from 1910. But the occupational policy of Japanese states toward Korea lasted since 1970s. So Koreans moved first or freely, it depends on each situation, to Japanese islands just to find work, to just find new life. And this place where they moved in a large number was Hiroshima. It was the military center of pre-war Japan. And Korean laborers, especially during the Second World War, so during the Pacific War, they were brought there to work in the factories concerned to the military business. That's why there were so many so many people, Koreans, who just suffered from the A-bombs. So the number of the victims of Korean side reaches 50,000, from 30,000 to 50,000, and taking into consideration like Nagasaki and Hiroshima together, it makes around 70,000 Koreans who suffered from the A-bomb blast. So Obama wasn't the first one who mentioned the problem, the issue of Korean victims. So the first moment when Koreans were given as those who passed away in Hiroshima was August 1990. And this date is extremely important for Japanese remembrance and just memory, because it was just after a year after the Hirohito emperor passed away. So Japanese were allowed to speak about the history and about the memory of the events of Asia-Pacific War. So the first one was the Hiroshima mayor, who delivered a peace declaration. A peace declaration is a speech that is delivered by mayors of Hiroshima each year on August 6. He told, "We honestly hope that positive efforts will be made to promote support for those Hibakusha resident on the Korean Peninsula, in the United States and elsewhere, and we already dedicate ourselves to the cause of peace." So, what is the history of the monument in memory of the Korean victims of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima? The whole process of thinking, projecting the monument and constructing it came from a small group of people from South Korea. So they were calling the victims those who endured more than their share of misery, yet whom few remember. There is one important aspect from the Korean and Japanese politics. When Japan remembers after a few years of being not aware of the tragedy of Hiroshima because it was censored by Americans, they remember and they promote the Hiroshima tragedy as their own history of World War II. In Korea, it's a little bit different because Korean politics use Hiroshima as a needed attack for gaining the independence. So when the victims, those who suffered from the atomic blast, came back to Korea after the Korean War, for example, they weren't allowed to be treated by Korean doctors, because if it went out, it would say like, wow, so our citizens, they suffered as well. So you cannot use the symbol of Hiroshima as the symbol of our independence. So frequently, and I will talk about it just in a minute, Japanese government was sending doctors, like physicians, to Korea to treat the victims, or they were taken to the US or to Japan to be treated. So this monument is not convenient for both sides, for Japanese and for Korean. For Japanese, because it reminds about the occupation of Korea and about the pre-war history of their nationalism and militarization, especially in the case of East Asia. And for Koreans, because it breaks somehow their myth of independence. And Japan, who was treated properly by Americans to give the freedom to the whole Asia. So when politicians refer to this monument, to the monument of the Korean victims, they tell the story about the Koreans who were brought to Japan to be killed, and it is described as a more severe appeal. So I will tell a few words about the construction and the appearance of the monument. So it was created in 1970, and it was established by the Construction Committee for Monument in Memory of the Korean victims of the A-bomb. So it is situated on a turtle-shaped base because regarding to the Korean mythology, turtles shaped a bridge through which the first king of Korea came to his kingdom. So I told you that the obelisk was raised in the place where the prince's body was found after the attack. And on this monument, the inscription in Chinese appears, in memory of Prince Yigu and the other 20,000 or more souls. This person, Prince Yigu, is also inconvenient for Korean side. He was a Korean prince who was a lieutenant colonel in Japanese army. And he wasn't the first laborer. So this is the second case why Korean government doesn't call for the memory and for this monument, only a certain group of activists. In 1999, when the monument was moved to the park, inside the park, the Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi officially visited it and paid a tribute towards the victims. But if we, just because I think, yes. Okay, so just to go to the conclusion. So, but when I did my research in the minutes of the National Diet of Japan, I was trying to find the speeches that referred to the Korean Hibakusha, so the atomic A-bomb victims. I searched for the term Kankoku Jingenbaku, which means Koreans and the atomic attack, and I was able to find among 55 minutes only 4 that referred to this issue. The first one from 70s was the most important, while just changing the law regarding the victims of the A-bomb. And one politician from the party, which is very towards Koreans, he mentioned that there were Koreans that suffered the attack. The rest was rather the labor code and talking about Koreans that were living in Japan. If it was in the context of the atomic blast, it was delivered by the leftish politicians who are against this nationalist attitude of Japanese government. So to conclude in one word, the monument of Korea, in one sentence, the monument of Koreans that lost their lives in the atomic attack is the place, the memorial that is needed by those who survive or their descendants. So for a small group of activists, especially outside Japan, but for the politicians on both Korean and Japanese sides, it's a very inconvenient place because it brings to mind the memory of the events. Both sides, they just don't want to remember. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Barbasiewicz. And our next speaker is Mrs. Ksenia Surikova. She's a lecturer at the Department of Museum Studies and Conservation of Monument of the St. Petersburg State University and the leading specialist at the Department of Strategic Communication of the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, the Kunstkamera, right? She has received several grants, including the research grant of the Russian Foundation for Humanities for the project Phenomenon of Media in the Practice of Art Exhibitions early 21st century. Her research interests include the relationship between memory, commemorative practice, and memory places like memorials, museums, and monuments. And Mrs. Surikova will speak about images of memory, monuments, and memorials of Second World War in Russia and Belarus.
Thank you very much for introduction. My paper considers the main aspects of the culture of remembrance about events associated with the Second World War in modern Russia and Belarus. and how does it influence the visual language of the war monuments and memorials, focusing on several memorial objects being produced in recent years that are compared with the exemplary Soviet monuments. Today, historians and sociologists note an increase of interest in Russia to the Soviet past. This trend is demonstrated by opinion polls, state-sponsored documentary and feature films, state cultural policy, exhibition initiatives of particular museums, and national holidays. In addition, a general trend begins to take shape towards the militarization of many events and memorable dates that are non-military by implication. For example, on November 7 this year, on the day of centennial anniversary of the October Revolution, a solemn march took place in the Red Square in commemoration of the military parade on November 7, 1931. On the Russian Flag Day, the military airplanes fly over the Red Square. On the Russia Day, the military march also along the Nevsky Prospect, the main street of St. Petersburg. The military themes are being introduced into the urban space not only symbolically, but also physically. This September, a statue to Mikhail Kalashnikov was unveiled in the center of the Moscow. Leaving aside the aesthetic qualities of the statue, it is worth paying attention to its symbolic component. I'm sorry. I want to show some elements. Oh, thank you very much. I'm sorry. The figure of Kalashnikov with the machine gun is placed next to the figure of St. George, the victory bearer. It's this. I'm sorry. One of the symbols of Russia. Once again, that gives evidence that the fact that the modern Russia is very closely connected not only to the Soviet period of history, but also to the events of the Great Patriotic War. One of the methods of studying the problems to the collective memory and the image of the national history is to study the memorial activity, imagery, symbolics, and function of monuments, activity related to their construction or conversely demolition, public consent and structure of relation between power and local communities regarding matters of the monument installation and attitude towards monument. Probable ways to talk about events associated with the Second World War in Russia and Belarus are characterized by the following features. Winning is the main motive. Although the memory of the war is full of tragic stories, they remain unexamined and are not involved in the process of constructing national memory about the Great Patriotic War. Narrations usually are focused on the triumph, while the trauma is mostly excluded from public debate. The result of the war is given more importance than the experience of the war itself. The fact of having gained victory finally is more important than all the negative aspects associated with the war. Significant losses of life, military and civilian collaboration, occupation, repression in the army, Soviet war crimes. And the second feature is homogeneity. In Russia and Belarus, the culture of remembrance is static, almost sacred. Its main themes are patriotism and militarization. Individual fate in the Soviet Union and modern Russia plays a subordinate role. Patriotism and militarization form a special discourse of trauma, which may use only one visual language, generating a number of similar monuments. This type of monument, which appeared in the USSR, continue to be reproduced in modern Russia and Belarus. Next, I suggest that a number of examples to be considered that illustrate these provisions. In memory of the 75,000 Soviet soldiers who died during the assault of Berlin, 3 monuments were erected in Berlin after the end of the Second World War. It was those monuments that laid the foundation of the visual language, which until now is used in building the monuments and memorials dedicated to the Great Patriotic War. This is a monument to fallen Soviet soldier in Tiergarten, Berlin. It was inaugurated on November 1945. The core of the memorial is a concave row of columns with a large center column, which is a pedestal for an 8-meter bronze statue of a Soviet soldier. The inscriptions on the column are dedicated to the different kinds of troops and keep lists to the dead soldiers. The columns are flanked on the left and right by 2 Soviet tanks that were the first to reach Berlin and 2 mortar guns, which took part in the Battle for Berlin. On the right and left, on the main path, there are the burials of the dead Soviet officers. Soviet War Memorial in Pankov, Berlin, was inaugurated in 1949. In the area of the memorial, there were buried the remains of Soviet soldiers fallen during the Battle for Berlin. In the center of memorial, there is a 33-meter tall obelisk made of cyanide. Around the memorial, there are 100 bronze tablets in stone where the names of fallen soldiers are written, and 8 burial grounds are placed. In front of the obelisk, a statue of Russia Motherland is situated, where wreaths are laid during ceremonies. On the base of the statue, made of black porphyry, there are 32 bronze tablets bearing the names of the fallen officers. The total area of the memorial is about 30,000 square meters. And Soviet War Memorial in Tractover Park. It was inaugurated on 1949. The center of the composition is a bronze figure of a Soviet soldier. I'm sorry. Yes, it is. It's in the second. The center of the composition is a bronze figure of Soviet soldier carrying a German child he rescued in his own arm and resting his sword in the shattered swastika. In the sketch of the monument, the soldier had a machine gun in his free hand, but following the suggestion made by Stalin, the sculptor substituted the machine gun with the sword. In front of the monument, there is a row of stone slabs depicting the key episodes of the war and the kneeling soldiers against the background of stylized stone flags. Despite the fact that it was unveiled before all over, this monument is the final part of the triptych, which also includes the monument Rear to Front in Magnitogorsk and Motherland Calls in Volgograd. It's understood that the sword, forged by the bank of the Ural River, was later raised by the Motherland in Stalingrad and lowered after victory in Berlin. The Motherland Calls, or Rodina Zовет, in Volgograd. It was inaugurated in 1967. The sculpture is several meter height figure of a woman who took a step forward with a sword raised. The statue is an allegorical image of the motherland calling her sons to fight the enemy. Rear to Front in Magnitogorsk was inaugurated in 1979. The monument is a two-figure composition of a worker and a soldier. The statue of worker is oriented in the east towards the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works. The statue of the soldier is oriented to the west towards the general area where the enemy was during the war. It's interesting that the visual representation of pre-revolutionary period were transferred to the imagery of both the Soviet and nowadays memorials. An example is an image of a partisan whose iconography had not changed since first war with Napoleon, or Russian peasant glorified as a defender of the fatherland. There are just a few examples of a huge number of the monuments dedicated to the events and participants of the Great Patriotic War. Given that they have the same main elements of the visual language, which once again indicate that the war memorials in the Soviet space are expressed as formulas that belong to the conventional language of historical memory. The elements that are repeated the most often are following. Concrete steels containing the name list of people who went to the war. The steels are of pyramidal or rectangular shape with a red star on top or faces. Image of the flag, and figure plastic composition depicting the solemnity of the place and the significance of the event. And sculpture. Soldiers, an image of the valiant warrior defender. Woman, an image of a woman mother, sometimes with a child. Partisans, cranes, a symbolic Kremlin wall, if related to the defenders of Moscow. Finally, an eternal fire or an image of burning torch. All these expressive means, technique and symbolic, are actively produced in nowadays monuments. Please look at the following images of monuments and memorials where the same elements are used. Immortal Regiment Monument in Tula was inaugurated this year. The Immortal Regiment Monument is made in the form of 7-meter flag with mosaic applied to it that comprise thousands of the photographs of the soldier, which were uploaded to the Immortal Regiment project website by Tula region residents. A huge panel picture is made up based on the theme of the flag bearer at the Reichstag wall photograph. Next is monument Tyumen to the winner. It's in the city Tyumen, in north of the Russia. It was inaugurated in 2050. The monument is a bas-relief depicting iconic war themes. It is interesting that the themes and solutions were searched for, according to the author, among the frontline photographs, the war prose and poems, films, classical music, and thematic song creation. Some details of this monument. Monument of Victory, Lipetsk. It was inaugurated in 2050. The monument is still 38 meters height, crowned with an Order of Victory. Monument of Victory, Vorkuta. It was inaugurated in 2001. It represents 3 gun barrels and entwined with 3 branches, and at the very top there are storks, birds of the peace and the good. There was a number of monuments set up at the initiative of Russian Military Historical Society, where evident is not just the use of similar technique and themes, but the practically complete identity of these monuments. I can show it faster. You can see the region, and you can see that it's the same, and the same. This is you understand. This is different monuments in different regions, but it's the same. The same, but it's in Pskov. And you see that the same symbols and other. And this is about 2 examples from Belarus. It's a Katyn Memorial Complex, was inaugurated in 1969, was created in memory of the Belarusian village destroyed by the Nazi during the Great Patriotic War. The memorial complex covers an area of about 50 hectares. In the center of the memorial composition, there is a 6-meter bronze sculpture, the Unconquered Man. A man with a dead child in his arm. Nearby there are closed and granite slabs symbolizing the roof of the barn in which the village were burned. Despite the artistic expression and emotiveness of the central monument of the memorial, there is also a repetition of themes and symbols here. The obligatory eternal fire, the trees of life, and memorial wall. And the last example, Trostenets Memorial, it's in Minsk, was inaugurated in 2050. This memorial was built at the location of the Trostenets concentration camp, the largest death camp in the territory of Belarus and the occupied region of USSR. The memorial consists of the Gate of Memory, two steels that symbolize the gate leaves and have the image of the bodies of prisoners, and memory alias, and two railroads car that remind of what was used to bring the prisoners to the camp. In addition to using a standard set of spatial and visual solution, an obelisk, an alley with pyramidal tombstones of nameless graves, these memorials inherit the Soviet tradition of generalization and mythologization. The memorial was not built in the area of mass execution. The area is several kilometers away in the forest, and it's maintained in good condition by efforts of voluntary organization. But at the location of a library camp, according to a number of researchers, there was no death camp as such, similar to Birkenau or Treblinka in Minsk. The freight cars that meet the visitors to the memorial are not just non-genuine, as a matter of fact. They are reproduced with errors and have little in common with the actual transport that was used to bring the prisoners. The Russia and Belarus directly inherit from the USSR the consciousness of the victorious country that saved the world from Nazism. Therefore, the structure of the memory of the Great Patriotic War is the only consistent historical themes up to date. Almost unchanged, it's visually and thematically inherited from the Soviet public discourse and is central to the today's Russian vision of our own history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Surikova. And our last speaker is Yaroslav Pasko, who is professor of sociology and philosophy at the Donetsk National University of Management at Ukraine. Between 1994 and 1998, he studied social philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences.
Thank you very much.
No, not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet. In 1998, he obtained a PhD degree in philosophy. In 2005 and 2006, he studied at the Catholic University of America in Washington. He received several grants and participated in a number of research projects. So maybe I will conclude that he's an author of 77 articles and books, and his academic interests include the social and cultural aspects of post-Soviet transformation, historical memory, post-colonialism, political theory of recognition, civil society, social reconstruction and modernization within Ukrainian society. And Professor Pasko will speak about monuments as a factor of historical memory and identity threat, Donbass and Ukraine.
Thank you very much. My presentation connected with the controversial model of historical memory in Donbass and Ukraine. Since 1991, Donbass and independent Ukraine have been in the symbolic conflict of historical memory models and in a point of values contradictions. It is a real problem for post-Soviet modernization in Ukraine and identity threat to both Ukrainian and Donbass community. communities. After Maidan, the conflict of identities acquired sharper forms. The hypothetical transformation of Ukraine from post-Soviet country to the European model of social order and turned to common Central European model of memory became the reason of pro-Russian social mobilization in Donbass and the source of the problem for Ukrainian unity as independent states through the popularization of Russian monumental cultural markers and mass symbols. Political conflict the last 3 years, as well as the tension around the monuments of memory, reflected the threat for both identities. The clash of vision of history and ontological strategies in Donbass and Ukraine is the consequence of fundamentally controversial model of historical memory, the vision of the Wieners in Second World War, which in the Soviet textbooks was called Great Patriotic War, versus historical memory of a humiliated nations, memory of colonized nations. A significant part of historical memory in Donbass was formed in Soviet time and connected with domination of Russian political discourse, their cultural expansion and social unification. The memory served as a real instrument of both political manipulation and social exclusion of the other memory, whose representation of memory are different from Russian model of history. Pro-Russian national elites in Donbass attempt to legitimize themselves as a true bearers of Soviet memory connected with the monumental tradition of Soviet past. Meanwhile, in the 90s, the dichotomy of Soviet and Ukrainian framework of historical memory in Donbass was not obvious. The conflict of local and national version of memory did not seem as an insurmountable obstacle for staying within borders of our country. Before the Revolution of Dignity and Orange Revolution, a Russian annexion of the parts of Ukrainian territory, symbolic meaning of Soviet ideological monuments and their political influence on the pro-Russian movements and parties in Donbass region was practically invisible. Despite the domination of the common with Russia historical memory in Donbass and its incompatibility with Ukrainian historical narratives and monuments of national history, Soviet mythology and Russian discourse in Donbass before Maidan did not provoke any aggressive conflict of identities and hostility to Ukrainian cultural markers, acts of violence on the Ukrainian streets. The cultural and historical explosion and anti-colonial revolution 3 years ago exacerbated the existing contradictions of historical memory in Ukrainian society. The crucial issue is which social factors of the Ukrainian revolution contributed to the mythologization of ideological monuments by pro-Russian communities and suddenly became a trigger to the mass protest in Donbass against Ukrainian institutions and Ukrainian cultural symbols, as well as the embodiment of independent historical narratives. The answer to this question requires the analysis of historical contradictions, mental contradiction, evaluation of the rootedness level of Ukrainian historical memory in Donbass communities, and clarification of the issue to what extent the historical memory of Donbass rebellions can be compatible with Ukrainian memorialization efforts in the context of reconciliation in future. It is evident that Soviet historical memory was formed in Donbass region during the second half of the 1950s, mid-1980s. In that time, Donetsk acquired a clear Soviet geography. 7 of the 9 districts of the city for a long time continue to carry the names of Soviet party leaders. Each of the districts is marked by a Soviet monument related to the Bolsheviks' past and Soviet leaders, with a few exceptions. Clement Voroshilov, as the person who gave the name of the central district of Donetsk, had to give way to the favor of two central figures of the Soviet ideological structure in the state of the city. In 1969, on the central square of Lenin, the main urban monument to the leader of the world proletariat was unveiled. There was erected 160 Lenin monuments in the city and 270 in the region at the beginning of the 1970s. A monument to Artyom Sergeyev was raised in 1968, supported by the leaders of Soviet army and miners' generalities. This monument, commonly known as a symbol of regional freedom due to its location and closeness to the myth of Donbas autonomy, was devoted to the men who fought against the integration of Donbas in Ukrainian administrative and cultural area. This monument became a manifestation of Donbas identity and symbol of the armed soldier of the so-called Donetsk People Republic, the place of publicity for the leaders DPR, Zakharchenko, Motorola, Givi, and others. Most of the Donbas cities have Soviet toponymic and adherence to emotional aspects of Soviet history. Additionally, in contrast to Ukrainian model of history, the regional memory was seen as more rooted in the regional history and glorification of the Soviet time as the patterns for the present. In the context of Ukraine negative European integration, governing Donetsk elite used some Donetsk monuments, such as the monuments to unknown soldiers, Lenin, Artyom, the monument Pushkin, for the legitimacy of pro-Russian political regime and policy of territorial mobilization. One of the common signs of all Donbas inhabitants is a memorial complex in Saugrave, which was and continues to be a symbol of Soviet great victory and the factor of belonging of the regional community to the past. For a long time, this memorial was the place of emotional memory and cohesion for all generations, the point of cultural intersections and solidarity of ethnic communities, the place of pride and joining of people. The unknown soldier in the consciousness of Donbas people was a symbol of suffering and has physical attributes in belonging to past. Alexei Yurchak pointed out that public display of Lenin monuments in the media played an important role in legitimizing the Soviet identity. In spite of social conflict, injustice inherited from Soviet and post-Soviet social order, the continuation of economic stagnation, the absence of identity dynamic, and the stability of Soviet memory in Donbas are out of the questions. The polls and review in Donetsk allows the historical orientation of people towards the Soviet system of memorialization, orientation to the Soviet sign of memory. Ukrainian cultural tradition, Ukrainian life world in Donbas were colonized by a bureaucratic system. Donbas memory is based on the use of symbolic monumental culture, which stems from a shared common fate and common memory of all generations. The Soviet memory for old and young generation is common symbol. Approximately 60% of young people confirm the central meaning of Soviet history and its ideological patterns of the past. It's evident that official memorialization efforts did not correspond with private and anti-communities, inhabitants of Donbas, Jewish, Greeks, German. Their history was marginalized in Soviet past and after Soviet past, was marginalized and have been forgotten in Donbas. It should be noted that in the last period of Soviet times, Elva said, LSS in the 90s, the erections of Jewish memory monuments devoted to Golda Meir and Theodor Herzl were prohibited by Ukrainian administration in Donbass. Similarly, German symbols of memorialization in industrial regions were expelled from public sphere. A new policy of commemorative memory in Donbass was proposed by Ukrainian intellectuals through the recognitions and memorialization of the symbols of Velvet Revolution, as well as the popularization of such intellectual symbols of Central European memory, common memory for Ukrainian and Central Europe. This model of memory, which entered into the conflict with Donbass symbolic order, it was not perceived in the framework of the official Donbass discourse. The memory of Ukrainians intellectuals, inheritance from Vasil Stus, Simonenko, historically came in conflict with ideological symbol of Soviet past and with the model disseminated by a Donbass political class. In the early part of the 19th century, the social theorist Vyacheslav Lipinski wrote about the intellectual role of national monuments and symbols in national building and in shaping the moral pivot of Ukrainian nation. Lipinski saw intelligentsia's natural law as a moral factor and one of the forces of national policy of memorializing. He considered the intelligentsia of that time in both Western and Eastern Ukraine as a social force of social changes. According to his views, it stimulates the process of self-government, enlargement of historical creation and mobilization of civil society. After the fall of Soviet regime in Donbass and turn from communist state monopoly, historical mission of Ukrainian intellectuals related to the implementation of national tradition and preservation of national monument symbols was ignored by official power. Memorials of Shevchenko, Stus, Simonenko were marginalized and did not become a part of educational traditions in the region as patterns of Donbass belonging to Ukrainian common heritage. In other words, colonial cultural domination led to annihilation of value standards and dehumanization of cultural and intellectual standards in colonized countries. A similar view was expressed by Ivan Zyuba. Soviet cultural policy for Ukrainian regions was a policy of Russification and destruction of national cultural foundation of existing social communities, as well as the representations against intellectual elite that led to degradation of national identity and moral corrosion in our society. In this context, my hypothesis is connected with the key role of intellectuals as driving force of national memory, shaping and value opposition to official Soviet and post-Soviet discourse in Donbass. The Ukrainian intellectual community in Donbass considered the monuments of Ukrainian poets as a factor of Ukrainian identity versus cultural occupation and colonization by the Russian Empire. The problem is which way to reconcile the memory of Donbass and memory of Ukraine. It's a real problem. It's evident a significant difference between Ukrainian and Donbass was the importance of national history as a part of their identity, while for the Ukrainian history played a significant part. For Donbass population, this future was rather suppressed. Only 4 out of 10 mentioned history as a significant part of their identity. In this context, I think the conflict in Donbass, the role of the aggressive conflict between two territories was provoked by a Russian social order, Russian political power. In every day, in the context of national history, between Ukrainians population and Donbas population was normal relation, but unfortunately, the problem of mentality, the problem of real political situations provoked a serious conflict in the memory. I don't understand which way to solve this problem, which way to solve the problem of controversial model of historical memory. It's necessary to initiate dialogue. It's evidently that Donbas population considered Ukrainian memory as a threat for regional identity. It's a real problem for reconciliation. It's a real problem for normal dialogue. Unfortunately, approximately 60% of Donbas populations considered Ukrainians to be a national threat. This threat induces defensive attitude against Ukrainians. It's approximately 70% of Ukrainians considered Donbas population as a real threat for national consolidation, for normal existence, Ukrainian historical memory. For Donbas population, the central monuments is the monuments in Donbas. The central monuments is the monuments of unknown soldiers, the monuments of Lenin, the monuments historically connected with the Soviet past. For Ukrainian population more oriented on the formation of national framework, of the connection of national framework. In this context, the monuments of the national symbols, the monuments of Bandera, Żuchowski are very important for Ukrainian independence, for Ukrainian memorialization. In this context, it's not easy to understand which way to consolidate nations. It's a real problem. It's a real task for future generation, probably. Now, the conflict and gaps between memories of Soviet past and memories of the new nations is the point of aggressive policy in public and private sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pasko. And it is now time for the commentary, which will be given by Tadeusz Żuchowski, who is an art historian, professor of humanities at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. In 1990, he obtained a doctorate in art history on the basis of his dissertation, The Problem of German Patriotic Painting between the year 1800 and 1848, and the work of Caspar David Friedrich, and became an assistant professor at the Institute of Art History of Adam Mickiewicz University on the basis of his academic achievements and the thesis entitled Papal Palace in Vatican from the end of the 5th century to the beginning of the 16th century, Ceremonial and Evolution of the Residential Complex. He received the habilitation degree in History of Art. In 2012, he was awarded at the title of the Professor of the Humanities, and now Professor Żuchowski will comment on the speeches.
Thank you very much for introduce, and thank you very much for your presentations. They give a wide spectrum of problems, but above all, they make aware how monuments are perceived by various disciplines resulting from their tradition and their ideological determinations. First, general remark. All the presentation refer in varying degrees to war memorials, while for the speakers from former socialist bloc, the World War II is the nucleus of their considerations or referring point. Only Dr. Cakir goes beyond this frame. For her, the point of reference is terrible battle of the First World War and manipulative commemoration of its victims. It is worth adding that for Dr. Pasko, the problem of war is not important itself, but the ideological message that monuments commemorate. His presentation stretches between the Sovietization of Ukraine and the current war in Donbass. Gallipoli is an exceptional subject. It remains in the general consciousness as a place of the great battle of First World War, and above all, a huge graveyard of cemeteries, a vast area turned into related memorials of coalition and Turkish troops. The Gallipoli Peninsula permeated by a history that does not end after First World War. The field of the battle lasting a year turns into a cemetery, and the cemetery turns into a political manifestation and manipulation. Turkey's opening by Atatürk to Europe, a hero from Gallipoli, makes Gallipoli a place of transfer, games, and touristic exchange. The complex of Gallipoli memorials is a great example of how monument politics is incorporated into state ideology. On the one hand, what has been happening and is happening today at Gallipoli is like a seismograph of foreign relation by Turkey, but it is also a record of changes in the Turkish mentality. Dr. Cakir spoke about joint celebration as well as exclusion practices, including those resulting from Turkey international relation. Turkish Gallipoli memorials are surrounded by new narratives, new components. Some narratives, like inviting the US in Gallipoli ceremony, may surprise. Some have not yet been realized. Dr. Barbasiewicz worked on monument to the Korean victims of Hiroshima. The beginning of the circumstances of the monument's setting remain in the dark. From whose exactly initiative it was erected? Who decided about its shape and the choice of the place? What was official statement of the Japanese government and what the reality was like? Koreans in Japan considered themselves as the first victims of the World War II and as victims of a bomb. We know that the Memorial Committee could not set up the memorial stone inside the Peace Memorial Park, and it was erected at the western end of the Hankava Bridge on the street corner near the site where the body of Korean Prince Yu was found after the bombing. Prince was a lieutenant colonel serving in Japan Army. Therefore, it is worth noting that the inscription in English does not mention the death of the prince. It is true that many years Korean groups tried to have their monument moved inside the park. They were rebuked by local government, who said, there is no place, but everything is obvious here. It is worth remembering that in 1969, the government of Hiroshima decided that no new monument would be erected in the park. I remind you that the park in Hiroshima was designed by Kenzo Tange. Then this decision by government of Hiroshima was suspended several times. Over the years, Korean organizations in Japan related to South Korea and those related to North Korea could not agree on translocation of monument. Indeed, when the monument was moved into the park in July 1991, it was not get the proper rank. For example, it wasn't marked on the official map of Hiroshima. I would not say, however, that it was set aside. In new place, shrubs of Rose of Sharon were planted around the monument. Those flowers are a symbol of Korea. After Obama's visit and the resulting discussion, many things have changed. In April 2017, also other trees imported from South Korea were planted at the monument. The presented by Dr. Barbasiewicz work is an interesting example of expanding of the monument space. The monument, mainly because of Obama, eventually appeared on the internet. Photos from the last time document the monument as well kept. Ms. Surikova assumes that the memorials that recall the memory of the World War II in Russia and Belarus are an official reworking of talking about the traumatic past. It is interesting to note that as the starting monuments, she presented the memorials erected in Berlin, in city conquered by the Red Army. It is understandable how these monuments would be useful to rework of trauma. These are not monuments in the former Soviet Russia territory, and even more so in the present neither Russia nor Belarus. The presentation was to show that monuments were built a homogeneous experience of a war in the territories of Russia and Belarus. It is difficult to accept this construction because Belarusian examples do not confirm this thesis, although Ms. Surikova means that they are very similar. post-war Belarus largely consisted of the pre-war territory of Poland, and this part was occupied by the Soviet, which caused that the same areas of Belarusian Republic were excluded from the state's communist commemoration. Another extremely important question is the circumstances of creating of the big memorial complex of Nazi victims in Katyn. Its construction was not caused in any way by circumstances of World War II. Why Katyn became a special place for all Soviet Russia? Katyn is a very interesting example of memorial of paramnesia or cover memorial. The choice of village was not the result of terrible events by the similarity of the name Katyn with another village, Katyn, where the Russians murdered over 4,000 Polish soldiers. The most insufficiency left a fragment devoted to war memorials erected nowadays in Russia and in former Soviet Federative Socialistic Republic. It surprises, first of all, that these monuments were built very late. If the monument in Stalingrad, i.e. Volgograd, was unveiled in 1967. It is also surprising that the narrative form remains extremely traditional. I would add that, to my knowledge, the wave of immense Soviet war memorials begins with the complex in Leningrad. However, between 1967 and 1969, colossal memorial complexes arise in Soviet Russia, among which we include Volgograd, Katyn, and Sarmohyla in Ukraine. Ms. Surikova said also about a new big wave of monuments commemorating the Great Patriotic War. I have a question concerning this. How do you explain this phenomenon? Dr. Pasko undertakes using sociological tools to investigate how monuments from the socialist past influence the creation of the national Ukraine identity, especially the ideological conflict between Donbass and the rest of Ukraine is important for him. After all, Donbass became, after obtaining independence by Ukraine, a reservoir of the remembrances about glorious Soviet past. It is important for Pasko to support his thesis with schemes based on post-colonial methodology. The mental framing of the narration about the past, so strong and lasting in Ukraine, was preserved by monuments, monuments of oppressors, monuments of events important from the perspective of dominators, and even the monuments of the national heroes shown in convention approved by dominator. They determine the landscape of memory, which is not easy to liberate from the lasting legacy. The confrontation with Soviet heritage became important for the nascent state. Monument of ancient ideologies still cast long shadow on Ukraine. According to Outlaving, the communist monument in 2015, and such a monument in the country have to be removed. But among there are monuments that are under protection as national heritage. How is going the discussion on this subject in Ukraine? No. It is my question and short remarks on Ms. Melzacka paper. Ms. Melzacka consider how the narrative of war, especially built by monuments, is transformed and modified. She proposed the term counter-monument for this. In fact, if we put a term this way, then everything can be a counter-monument. Because the whole problem, as Melzacka says, is at the rhetorical level. Monumentality is not category assigned to a monument, although it reaches the same language tradition as monument. The monumental bonds with size. If monumentalization is understood as variation of elephantiasis or megalomania, then perhaps this thesis would be acceptable. In my opinion, it is also difficult to assume that the counter-monument proposed dialogue solutions and the counter-monument proposed dialogue solutions and the monument is non-dialogue. The example of Gallipoli show dialogism, also monument to the Korean victims of Hiroshima forces to interact. Many of the monuments cause reactions that push participants into active dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this commentary, which adds a lot to already fascinating presentations. And now we start with response. But please keep your statements concise, because we have only, I think, yes, 20 minutes. Okay. Can I have your...
Thank you for your comments, and thank you for the guidelines that you have provided us.
Oh, Mr. Pasko. No.
Is this working? Okay. Thank you for your comments and your guidelines to my paper. I share many of your thoughts. And there was one term that I underlined during my presentation. It's the memorial diplomacy. And with the current events in the world politics, I think it is better to underline this terminology, because with...
I'm sorry, but...
With this terminology, we can explain the current sentiments regarding the war memorials, especially for the past 3-4 years with the centenary. This memorial diplomacy and the commemoration of the First World War began to play a great role. And this has some economic and cultural consequences, which will lead historians to develop new theoretical framework for the memorial erection, for the remembering of the past, for the commemoration, and for the silence as well. We have been thinking on these terms. Although we talk about monument building, we should also talk about the silence, and how can silence also play a role in remembering the past, especially when we are talking about war and the mat race. it is very interesting. I mean, Turkish politics in general is going through a very strange, very different time period. Things are changing rapidly with the while the conjuncture also changes for the world politics. And once we were remembering this, the cult of Atatürk in Gallipoli, although there were other great commanders of the Ottoman army and the German army as well, we don't remember them. We tend to remember Atatürk for a very long time, and now we tend to remember with the current government, we tend to remember the Islamic elements in the Ottoman army, and with the re-Islamization of the education, the re-Islamization of the visual material in the media, things are changing, and we need to be careful while we are analyzing all of these. I mean, this is very sensitive material. So while researching on these subjects, we also need to be careful about not reaching absolute conclusions. I think this is a developing field with the developing policies. We have to be conscious about how to handle them. I may be a little bit political in my paper, and I'm usually a very political person myself, but I also try to limit myself, try to stop myself not to be too critical about the things and develop a much more objective and historical research on these topics. There weren't any questions directed to me, so yeah, I think I can pass to the other speakers.
Thank you, Professor, for such a great summarization of my presentation. I just wrote down like a few aspects, like issues from this summary, and I am very happy with the thesis of the expanding of monument space. This is very interesting for me, and I think I will just follow this statement of yours, but I would like to refer to the case of flowers. They were just given, this example was given while talking about this this creation of this monument space being expanded. Just recently, 2 months ago or something like this, those flowers were just destroyed by unknown person or people. And it wasn't the government that, even the city government that took care of just planting new one, but the people, the Hibakusha, the Japanese victims of the A-bomb, so the A-bomb survivors, who just want to keep this memory about Koreans vivid and would like to just break this bad image of probably Japanese person who did it. So like there are people who are unhappy with this Obama's statement on Koreans and bringing to our consciousness the question of Korean victims. At the end of your summary, you told that monuments cause reactions. And it was, of course, in the case of this Korean monument. I didn't tell it during my presentation, but we cannot forget that Korea is not one Korea. We've got South Korea and North Korea, and there are still different associations that try to preserve this memory of these Korean victims. So after bringing into the park at the end of the 20th century the monument of Korean victims, the voices came up to build another monument, another obelisk, because this one commemorates only the South Koreans. So this is not only the problem with remembering inside Japan by Japanese. This is not the problem of destroying this monument symbol, the flowers and so on. This is also a problem with Korea or Koreas that want this memory to be their own and to commemorate as much as it is possible. I am very grateful that you mentioned also Tange. This is a very interesting figure, an architect that designed the space, the park. What is interesting in this case is that Tange was the chief architect of Imperial Japan. He was young at that time, he was a student, but he won the competition. And he was asked to design the center of of Japanese imperialism. And he did it. When the Hiroshima Park was under, maybe not under construction, but was just was proposed to be designed. Like one American Japanese, he was asked to project this. But it was too much for Japanese who remembered those who dropped the bomb. So Tange, the person connected to Japanese imperialism, he designed the park. So there was no space for Koreans because he was in Korea designing the buildings for the imperial government. So he didn't even think about Koreans at the time, and that's why it was not allowed to bring anything into the park. So thank you very much for this very interesting point. And just to summarize, from like many years, from atheists, like Japanese Christians, Koreans, and so on, they find to introduce to the whole lieu de mémoire, we can say, as the park and a certain museum and obelisk and monuments are, the issue of Japanese history before the A-bomb. And there's nothing, so all the fights just there, just closed with one word. This is the leftist, communist, socialist idea, and Japan is the biggest victim of the war because they were bombed by the atomic bomb. So that's the thing. Thank you.
I've got the message that we have 15 more minutes, but still, please be brief, okay?
Thank you very much for the remarks and asking the question about the huge quantity of monuments about Second World War in Russia. I think this is a result of our state historical policy, I don't know, that choose the subject of Great Patriotic War like only non-contradiction in our history, because all other subject like revolution or I don't know Peter the Great, figure of Peter the Great, or maybe in early Russian history, there are very contradictory and complicated subject. And the Great Patriotic War, it's a good example of victory and of unity of our people. And then our I don't know who, maybe it's not a official, but the situation that's okay. I'm sorry. The state history policy is formed. I'm sorry. I think. I'm sorry. it's complicated. No, I don't know. I think there is I think it's a good subject in our history, and this is a subject that are clear to all our people, and then I think that it's a part of identity of our country. Of my country. Sorry.
Thank you very much for critical remarks. It's evidently 3 years ago in March, the monuments of Lenin in the center of the city, center of Donetsk, was the place. Was the place of common memory, common Soviet memory, the memory of all generation, young and old. Similar situation we can observe near the monuments of Artyom. And similar situation we can observe within the monuments of Kobzon, a symbol of mass culture. Yeah, in Donetsk. It's a real problem. It's a real problem for Ukrainian identity. We can observe in Donbass the joining, on the one hand, the memory of regional memory. I mean the regional memory, and on the other hand, the role of Soviet memory. It's not easy to understand which way to solve this situation. What's memory is more strong in this situation, Soviet memory or regional memory? But in some aspects, we can the point of intersection between regional memory and Soviet memory. In Ukraine, we have on the one hand some heritage, some elements, some segment of Soviet heritage. And on the other hand, the strong line, the strong memory, national memory, connected with the symbols of national traditions. It's a real problem for Ukraine. We can now very tension between Poland and Ukraine in the context of memory. But I don't know which way to build a new state, new national state in this situation. On the one hand, the Soviet memory. On the other hand, the memory of national hero, nationalistic memory. And I don't understand which way to solve these gaps, these contradictions. It's in this situation, the existing Donbass within Ukraine, it's a serious challenge for Ukrainian identity. It's a real problem. Thank you.
It might be better asking for truth, not for the memory only.
As I said, we have 15 more minutes, so if there are comments and questions, please introduce yourself if you could.
My name is historian, and I have 2 questions, one to Olga and one to Yaroslav Pasko. Thank you very much for all your presentations, and I really like them. First, it's about North Korea. Can you elaborate more on this? How in specifically North Korea this question of Korean victims is raised, especially in this like theme of nuclear power and these victims of nuclear power, so to say. And the second question or comment is to Yaroslav, and it's about Donbass monuments, and we know that in Ukraine, these Soviet memorials and Lenin monuments, they were all throughout all the Ukraine, and even in Kiev, there are a lot of Soviet monuments still. And so I don't believe that if there were no Soviet monuments in Donbass, we wouldn't have the war now. And I believe that the monuments and the memories are not the problem, really, because there are other problems which are much bigger. And these are also Ukrainian people who are living in Donbass, so these are not like Ukrainian nation against Donbass. People, so it's yeah, it sounds strange, and I just want to yeah, maybe to recommend you an article of Alexander Osipyan. He made a very good research on Donbass monuments and Donbass memory politics, and his argument is that after the Orange Revolution, the Donbass elites really worked hard to promote this anti-Ukrainian memories, to really like this anti-Banderovets, anti-nationalist memories, and they used it pretty much as a resource, as a political resource, which was activated very much in 2010 when Yanukovych came to power. So it was really about manipulations, not about really some specific memories or whatever. And Donbass is much bigger than the occupied territories now. So it really doesn't fit to the picture that where the Soviet monuments were maintained, the war came and this territory was occupied. So, because even in Kiev there are Soviet monuments still, and yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I agree with the situation in Donbass was provoked by political manipulation, was provoked by corporative groups in Donbass. But on the other hand, the problem is more controversial. In Kiev, now in Ukraine, we can observe the fighting against Lenin's heritage, against Lenin's monuments, in the quality of the monuments in Donbass was in Soviet epoch and now more and more than Ukrainian. And Soviet historical memory was rootedness in Donbass on a collective level and on the level of individual. It's a real problem for Donbass, for modernization of Donbass. It's a problem for Donbass is more serious than for Ukraine. The Soviet heritage in Donbass was more serious. The problem of heritage, of Soviet heritage in Donbass was more strong than in other regions in Ukraine. Evidently, in Ukraine, we have in Donbass we have some segments of Ukrainian memory, but approximately 90% of Donbass inhabitants connected with Soviet historical memory. We have some sociological polls by, for example, the sociological polls initiated by Golovacha and other Ukrainian sociologists. Sorry? When? It was sociological made in 1918, in 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Some sociological polls pointed out that Soviet memorial and Soviet memory dominated in Donbass region. Its memory connected with Soviet monuments. It's the problem in Donbass is more serious, more tragical than other regions. You know about the phenomenon of Ukraine now, the role of Leninapad. You know about the essence of Leninapad?
about the war because of the monuments. So
Yeah,
sorry.
it's monuments. Monuments. It's Donbass. It's the part of Soviet historical memory. It's the part of common memory of all generation in the past and now. It's a similar situation we have only in Lugansk. It's real differences between, on the one hand, Donbass, I mean Lugansk and Donetsk, and other hand, some territories of Ukraine. In Kiev, we have only small segment of Soviet historical memory, of small segment connected with the monuments. In Donbass, we have the domination of Soviet symbols and connected. It's the emotional adherence of people to Soviet historical memory. You, by the way, you can to read some articles. By the way, Metaphysica of Donetsk. It's a real book connected with the monuments and the role of monuments in the shaping of historical memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions or comments? Yes.
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so to answer briefly, so first of all, it won't be like regarding this specific Korean monument when we talk about North Korea. Of course, there is the General Federation of Korean Residents in Japan, and they are just strictly connected to the North Korean government. But when it comes to the, like you mentioned, like North Korean nuclear tries, like the whole Hiroshima becomes a monument, a place of remembrance. And I will answer from the perspective of political scientist, because it is my major here and field of studies. The all agreements that are now done by the Shinzo Abe government. So, for example, just the trials to change to amend the 9th article of the peace constitution so that Japanese cannot just participate in any war operations and so on and so on. They're justified when Kim is just shooting his rockets. Because easily mentioning Hiroshima and the great tragedy justifies the need to defend the territory, not to make the same tragedy again. So maybe it's to political science answer to this question, but Hiroshima as a whole is a symbol of the tragedy, and it is used as a tool by the politicians to make some serious movements in international politics and to just face the Kim's regime. And by the way, to change the constitution that was implemented by the American government. Thank you.
Yeah, I was extremely interested in that panel, especially because I visited all those countries which had been mentioned, even North Korea. I mean, we have to come to the conclusion that all those monuments are, of course, the results of political decisions. As well, the destruction of monuments are political decisions. The question is now, and I really think, as I'm not only a scientist, but a politician as well, I think the role of scientists to speak out openly in their societies on such questions should be, I would say, understood and practically realized in a bit higher way as it is done now. I don't think that we should get rid of all our history. I mean, there are a lot of sectors in our history. I mean, I'm Austrian, you know. We have got a lot of sectors. I mean, in Vienna, there's still, let's say, a monument for Russian soldiers. I mean, with the Austrian normal political situation, you wouldn't really connect that. And there are a lot of others. I mean, we had the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. There is a lot of monuments there. There are monuments now from our present time. I would say it would be fair if we as scientists, not politicians, as scientists say, okay, to the younger generation, this is history which has been done in that territory where we are living now. Because this is the best education, history education for all those. I don't know whether you agree, but this is just a proposal I have. Just one question, in addition to that, to Cakir. You made some commentary on the development in Turkey, the political situation. I didn't follow the erection of monuments in the last years. The last time I had been there three years ago or something like that. Has there been, with that new direction of Erdogan, a lot of monuments already erected and the destruction of other monuments? Because this is something which is happening quite often in parts of the world.
Yeah, I agree with your comments, the earlier comments about the education and how we should treat history and the politics and how we should separate them both. And once, during the First World War, in your country, in Austria, a mosque was built for the prisoners of the war. I mean, but it also worked as a monument during and after the First World War. I mean, I totally agree with you. These things, I mean, politics change and history remains. So we need to teach the younger generations the true history, separating it from the politics. I totally agree with that. And with the recent manifestations of the monument building in Gallipoli. When we are talking about Gallipoli, history and reality, the myth and reality, it blurs. It blurs for all the nations that were involved. It blurs for the British, it blurs for the Anzacs. Even for the French, who are not really very much interested in Gallipoli at all, although they were there. I mean, recent developments showed. Sorry, my eyes are pouring because of the light. In the recent manifestations taught me a lesson. I mean, there won't be any demolishing of monuments in Gallipoli. It's impossible because it is something which is very untouchable. Yeah, it becomes something very untouchable. You cannot touch it. You cannot criticize it. Even like in the literary and academic circles, it's impossible to criticize anything about Gallipoli. So there won't be any demolishing of monuments, but there might be erection of new ones. And with these new ones, we are most probably going to see the Islamization, as the textbooks are being re-Islamization in the textbooks, as we have observed recently. For example, the role of Atatürk is minimized, the role of the Muslim martyrdom is emphasized, and my recent research focuses on the religious aspects. Visual religious propaganda of the Ottoman Empire, backed by the Germans and the Austrians, financed by the Austrians mainly. So that kind of an image, the call for jihad, the proclamation of jihad. And now we are talking about new jihadism, martyrdom. These are, scary topics to talk about, but we will watch and see. And then as historians, as policymakers, as politicians, we will comment and implement on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time just for one question. Okay, and then the last question, okay.
Okay, so I would like to comment because you told us that it's just studying your history, but because these monuments, they just present the history. But the problem is that the history is written by the victors. And there is like a huge history because you use the word like the true history. We don't know what is the true history really. This is the case of the political groups, pressure groups, and so on and so on. So it's a very deep problem, and we can observe it even in contemporary Poland. If it's the narration of the victorious party in certain elections, or just the history given, as in the case of Hiroshima, by the victors who were Americans, and it was convenient for Japanese. So, like, I would agree, like, on 50%. So this is like, yes, you can study history. Yeah, you can study history from it, but you cannot forget that it was written by the victors. So, thank you.
Just a small comment. At this point, I think the archival, like, devoted archival work plays a great role, and it may change a lot of things, and the opening of closed archives will be a great contribution. I mean, we should open the archives and let the international scholars work on them.
Good idea for Poland too.
Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, Hienka Vitaly. First of all, there are no Soviet memorials in Ukraine left at all. They were taken away, destroyed, torn apart in the process of decommunization. And what is interesting, there was no opposition or no resistance. And why? In my opinion, it's because these memorials in part meaningless. And this case can be very interesting even to theoretization, because we used to think memorials in such triangulations, memorials, identity, and memory. But I don't think that this process goes so straightforward. Because, for example, in Ukraine, I think these memorials really were and still meaningless. What does it mean? It's like more habitual memory. If we go to the shop in the morning, we see these memorials, and there are no any meaning in that memorials. But later, as in case, for example, in Donbass, I think that some additional meanings can be attached to it. And for example, these meanings can be anti-Ukrainian. And my question to Yaroslav and maybe to other panelists will be, how do you think, in this case of some memorials which were originally programmed to produce a memory, would say Soviet memory, in case of this situation, how do you think these memorials could produce another memory of another kind, not connected to Soviet past? And how do you think this producing can be successful? Or it at all can be successful? And if so, how do you think how long it can be? Thank you.
Very brief answers, because the tour starts in 10 minutes.
It's your question for long debates, but as a whole, the history of Ukraine, the history as a whole, is the fighting against some version of memory, and monuments provoked the clashes between some version of memory. It's a real problem, it's a real challenge for Ukraine now. But it's the fate for Ukraine. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And there are no further questions and comments. And please ask the speakers again.